The Ain't No Fang Podcast. From Arizona Sports, Ain't No Fang.
Welcome into Ain't No Fang, Arizona Sports Diamondbacks podcast. I'm Alex Weiner with a special guest today. It's the host of the Wolf and Luke show on Arizona Sports, Luke Lapinski. How you doing?
Good, Alex. How you doing?
I'm doing great. And what drew me to invite you on today is that you guys were over at Salt River Fields earlier this week speaking to Diamondbacks players and executives. And your interview with Mike Hazen in particular was kind of piqued my interest. A lot of the stuff you guys were talking about in terms of not only the depth of the roster, but the sustainability of it, because this year there's been kind of a hyper focus on this year. They have a lot of guys who are coming off the books at the end of the year. And so because of that, there's been kind of an upped sense of urgency. But I also kind of liked what he said about the sustainability of it. And you can look at projections all you want, but if younger guys come up and play better than people expect or take leaps that they're anticipated to take, that can change everything. So I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on what you kind of took away from that conversation.
Yeah, I think it's one of the toughest things in sports, right? To have a team that is competing now but isn't sacrificing the future to do that, where you have that sense of urgency. Like, if you don't win the title this year, you're probably going to fall off a cliff in a year or two. That's not the Diamondbacks. They've done a really good job of building this team through draft and development. But, you get to the World Series 2 years ago and they realized, let's pivot a little bit and let's invest in what we have now, because we have a team that was a couple games away from winning the World Series. Sure. Why wouldn't you? And a team that just, swept the Dodgers too in the play, the last team to take the Dodgers out. So you go out and add a guy like Corbin Burns, you're in win now mode. There's no way around that. And as Mike Hazen brought up to us, when you have guys like Zach Gallen and Merrill Kelly and others that are free agents at the end of the season, you're also in win now mode. But at the same time, the future, I think, still looks good for this team, and that's a tough, it's tough to thread that needle, but they're doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen teams kind of go one way or the other, right? Where it's all wheeling and dealing. Guys, they mix in guys, then they get towards free agency, you trade them, you kind of start over again. We saw that with a team that traded with the Diamondbacks this offseason, right? Because they had guys like Josh Schnell in Cleveland, who they're going to be free agents at the end of the year. So you trade them now, and then you kind of reshuffle a little bit by getting a young pitcher and a draft pick. The Diamondbacks have been able to work the best of both worlds there. And, you look at the Corbin Burns edition and the Josh Naylor edition, they didn't give up much of anything in terms of their young core. They gave up Slade Ciccone, a young pitcher, but other than that, and they have some decent pitching depth at the upper minors. Other than that, they've been able to keep everything intact. So when you look at the younger guys that you may anticipate or hope take that next step, they're all still in the building.
Yeah, and that's, Mike Hazen and this front office have been good at making moves, like you said, where you're not really giving up a ton. You're really kind of minimizing the risk. I guess the only real risk with this team right now would be if you play out this season, you don't trade any of these free agents, you don't re-sign any of these free agents, which is obviously still a possibility. It doesn't just mean Zach Gallen's gone. And then, you don't win the World Series and they all walk. I mean, that would be the worst case scenario. But you can't eliminate all risk. At a certain point, you really do have to go for it. And I know people have different opinions on this, but to me, if you set the Dodgers aside for a second, I think the Diamondbacks are right up there with anybody in baseball with a chance to win the World Series. And I know you can't set the Dodgers aside. You can only do that for so long because they are in your league and your division, but you also can't just play scared because of the Dodgers. You know what I mean? Yeah. If you didn't stack up well against the Braves or some of these other teams, then maybe you would have to change course. But I honestly think they could beat any team in a playoff series, but they obviously have to get there.
Sure. I mean, when you have Corbin Burns and Zach Gallen and Merrill Kelly at the top of rotation, then you can at least match up with anybody in the postseason. And I agree to that point about the Dodgers. And the Dodgers can win 125 games this year. And I'm like, okay, that's not overly surprising. But at the same time, if you get yourself in there and you get yourself a shot at it, we've already seen what it looks like. And now this team is better than it was 2 years ago when they were in the World Series, at least on paper. Looking at the depth, because, Mike had some things to say about, right now his focus is the stalwarts are the stalwarts of the team, right? The only focus there is, please don't get hurt. Yeah. Don't get hurt. It's about managing and evaluating the depth that you have right now. And I think from a depth perspective, this team is more able to withstand some of the adversity they faced last year than they were at this point last year. Part of that is because they went through that adversity last year, and a lot of those players, either like a Corbin Carroll, went through it, got himself out of it, and now is probably better off for it. And then you have a bunch of younger guys who got their feet wet. And, now we've seen what Gilbert Diaz looks like in the major leagues if you need him at some point for any reason. And J Mart had a much bigger role last year than we anticipated. So I guess who are some of the younger guys now that you're looking at in terms of depth that it's like, okay, we kind of have some expectations for this guy, and this is going to make a difference compared to where we were looking at a year ago.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because I think that, one of the qualities this team has, really all the way up to the front office and down to the individual players, is they have shown an ability to learn when things, you learn from going to the World Series 2 years ago, but you also learn from kind of falling apart down the stretch last year, or on an individual basis. I mean, you brought up Corbin Carroll, and I know that's the easy one for me to start with, but like the fact that he was able to turn his season around mid-season is something that most vets can't do, and if you look at his overall numbers, I mean, I'm sure you've talked about this, his overall numbers at the end of the year basically look the same as his rookie year when he won Rookie of the Year unanimously. The average was different, but a lot of the other counting stats were very similar. So
he was 5th in the league in runs.
Yeah,
which is amazing after everything. Yeah.
So
8th in stolen bases.
And to be able to do that mid-season, while, in baseball, you don't really get, it's not like, hey, you take a week and a half here to kind of collect yourself.
You get the All-Star break and that's it.
Exactly. So I think that, we all look at their run total last year and we're like, well, that's going to drop off. And it probably will, because they were so far ahead of everybody else, but it also might not drop off that much. Jordan Lawler's a guy that I really am interested to see what they do with him, because we know that he's got incredible upside. It's tough to see like a clear path to playing time, but if he plays to his potential, they're going to want to play him somewhere. And maybe that's in AAA. Like if everybody's healthy, maybe it's still in AAA to get him the at-bats. But that's, kind of what you're talking about. If a guy gets hurt, you're not bringing in some utility guy or some
You're not signing somebody off the street to be like, okay, we just need an adult in the room.
It's nice to have a Jordan Lawler to step in. And even Alec Thomas off the bench for a little bit. I mean, if he gets going, we saw Jake McCarthy last year sort of in a position that Alec Thomas is in this year, and Jake McCarthy had an amazing year.
Love the parallel. I mean, last year we were going into spring training being like, is he going to make the opening day roster?
People were talking about him getting traded to Chicago.
And then all of a sudden now we're completely flipped, and now it's like, well, I think Alec's going to make the roster, but like, what kind of role is he going to have when he gets there? I like that point with like, can they not score as many runs as last year and still, because I still expect this to be, you lose Christian Walker, you lose Jock Peterson, it changes the look of the offense a little bit, but with some of the younger guys getting better, plus you bring in Naylor to kind of ease that a little bit, what if they're like 9th in scoring?
Yeah, I mean, that
their pitching is instead of 27th in team ERA, right? You'd expect it to be, top 10 ideally, but if it's top 12 and you have a top 9 scoring offense, that's a team that's going to make October.
Yeah, and I mean, their identity is obviously pitching and defense. That's the way they've tried to build it. They were first in runs scored by so much last year. I think it was only 3 teams were even within 100 of them. If they drop to 9th, they're fine. Maybe they drop to 3rd. Maybe they just don't lead everybody by as much. I mean, I have to think the Dodgers are probably going to lead the league in runs scored, and maybe there's another team or two, but I don't know that there's a lot to look at with the Diamondbacks where you'd say they're going to take a huge step back offensively, other than maybe a little regression to the mean because they scored so much. But again, Corbin Carroll wasn't really hitting in the first half. Eugenio Suarez wasn't really hitting in the first half. So just if you also bake in the possibility that some of these young guys are going to get better at the plate, or that a guy like Suarez maybe doesn't struggle as much as he did in the first half. Now he went off in the second half, so maybe it all evens out. But I just don't think it's crazy to think the Diamondbacks don't drop off that much offensively.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that for sure. And part of that too is health. They were pretty unfortunate last year. And it wasn't, the pitching obviously took center stage in that because it was kind of absurd.
Yeah.
There was a time in the season where Gallen, Kelly, Rodriguez, and Montgomery at the same time were on the injured list. And so you had like Blake Walston spot starts and Tommy Henry and whomever. You have to call up Christian Mania for his debut at Dodger Stadium against Shohei Ohtani. It's his first at bat. That's always fun. That's always fun to give a guy. But hitting wise too, losing Perdomo for as long as they did certainly hurt a lot. And losing Moreno in the second half when they did, losing Walker and Marte in the second half, certainly hurt a lot. So, yes, in terms of the pitching was certainly the main kind of storyline in terms of the injuries last year. You would like to hope that they get a little bit better injury fortune this year. And if they don't, we kind of talked about some of the guys who can step in, and it feels like they're in a little bit of a better spot to withstand that. So, I do like kind of looking up and down the roster and just kind of like playing out different scenarios. And it does kind of feel like they're in a little bit of a better spot than they were last year, even if, you lose a couple of big pieces.
Yeah, it just feels like they are built to, you make the comment with the pitching, they're kind of built to sustain some bad luck. I mean, you're going to have some bad luck over 162 games, but they're almost owed 7 starting pitchers right now for how many games they had to pitch last year with guys getting called up to, like you said, make a spot start in your Major League debut against Shohei and the Dodgers. But, who knows what they do as far as 7 starters, but they've made it clear.
We have so much time to get into that because
they're willing to wait.
We know about as much as we did when we showed up to the first day of pitchers and catchers in terms of what their starting rotation is going to look like, and even closer for that matter. And that's kind of expected at this point, right? Like they're not going to decide that this week.
Just let it play out.
Exactly. Yeah, let it play out. Hope everybody stays healthy. And then when it's 1 week until spring training ends, instead of we have 1 month until opening days here.
Yeah.
Thank goodness we're only a month away. Then we can kind of all figure that out. But for now, it's good to have these good problems. And that's been kind of a theming as we talk about the preview into the season, is that they have some pretty hard decisions to make, but it's not like, oh no, who's going to be our third baseman? It's more like, we have too many guys for this one spot. Yeah. What are we going to do with this? Yeah. Which is good.
It's a good spot. The only real pressing question is closer, and even that you can navigate that for a few weeks into the season if you need to.
Yeah, sure. They don't have guys with extensive closer histories, but they've had guys who stepped up in some big moments last year. J Mart comes to mind there, but so does Puck and so does Ginkel.
Yeah.
I think Hazen said to you guys on your interview this week, it's like a closer is kind of like a number one starting pitcher, where you're not one until you are one, until you get the experience to do it. So maybe they do have that guy, and maybe J Mart's going to be a closer for the next 10 years that we're kind of starting to see the evolution of, or maybe it's Puck. I don't know, but they have time to figure that out too.
For sure.
Cool. Luke, thank you so much for taking a few minutes. It's right before your show starts, nice. So I double appreciate you taking the time to sit down. So listen to Wolf and Luke on Arizona Sports from 10 to 2. I'm Alex Weiner. This has been Ain't No Fang. Keep it locked in on Arizona Sports for all things Diamondbacks coverage, as we are 1 month, ! Away from the start of the regular season.